You're watching.
You're watching.
You're watching.
You're watching
West Hartford.
West Hartford Community Television.
Community television.
Community television.
For the community.
For the community.
For the community. For the community.
For the community.
By the community.
By the community.
By the community.
By the community.
For the community. By the community.
And it's a wrap.
Hello and welcome to Shalom, Hartford. Today we're speaking to Debra Polivy. Rhymes with policy, and policies on fundraising and board management is what Debra Polivy is all about. She's a fundraising maven. She's written 2 books, and she's worked and lived in Israel, Morocco, Canada, and USA. Why fundraising? Stay with me, and we're going to find out the why of Debra Polivy. I'm Pat Kazakoff. You're watching Shalom, Hartford. You think of yourself as a maven?
I think of myself as an expert. I guess that's the translation of maven.
So how did this come about? Because you've been doing fundraising your entire adult life. What was in your background that made you do this?
I've tried to go back and forth between academia and fundraising, and to look at fundraising objectively, notwithstanding the fact that I've certainly immersed in that professional expertise,
So
or
tell
have
me,
that professional
tell me what was in your
expertise.
background that made you go into fundraising?
My background was I was involved with a very philanthropic family from birth, so I was always immersed in the importance of giving.
Was it your family that was philanthropic?
It was my mother's family that was philanthropic.
How did that come about?
My mother was an orphan. Her mother died at birth, I think. First, I have to say that my mother never talked about her background. Everything that I know has come from particularly one aunt that I call my aunt, notwithstanding the fact that she's not my real aunt. My mother was an orphan. Her father had 5 children, 2 of whom were old enough to be out of the house, and 3 were young. And he put the 3 young children into an orphanage. That orphanage was visited by Sarah Sussman, who is a philanthropist in her own right.
Now, is this the Sussman family of Hartford?
Exactly.
Okay.
And we're talking, I'd like to say, 75, 80 years ago. We're not talking today. My mother was 13 when she was in the orphanage. She had been there, I think, about 3 or 4 years. And so when Sarah Sussman came to the orphanage, the head of the institution said to her, these are 2 13-year-old girls. There was another one the same age as my mother. They were not related. And the head said, these women, or these girls, will never be adopted. They're too old. Sarah Sussman took the 2 13-year-olds to her summer home in Woodmont, Connecticut. I still remember that house vividly. And introduced the girls to her 4 children. These were her birth children. And at the end of the weekend, she brought the 2 girls back to the orphanage. She told her 4 children that she was going to take one of the 2 13-year-olds into the family as a ward, not adopt the child, just as a ward, and asked her children to vote which one they liked better. And I guess, as the story is told to me, that one was very pretty and one was very ugly. So they chose the pretty girl.
The 4 children chose the 4 pretty girl.
And Sarah Sussman said, no, that girl's going to make it in life. She doesn't need my help. And she chose the ugly duckling, who was my mother, who, by the way, became a magnificent woman.
And so that was how she stayed with the Sussmans her entire life.
Her entire life.
And that's why you called them your aunt, and that's why you called Mrs. Sarah Sussman your grandmother.
Right.
Not because by birth, but by life.
And my cousins always say to me, how come you don't introduce me as your cousin? Why do you always introduce me as your name? And it never even dawned on me that bothered them. And so I certainly changed the way in which I would talk about them to other people.
So how did your mother live as an orphan with the Sussmans? What was the lifestyle?
Well, she went from rags to riches. She was what, when you looked at the little Orphan Annie films, I mean, that was my mother. She was with Daddy Warbucks and initially she was very, very poor.
I've heard these kinds of stories, and there's always a little bit of resentment by the one who's taken. Did she have a bit of resentment?
I don't think so. I never felt that. I felt other things. She felt inferior. She used to call herself a fish out of water, but she never held any resentment. And as a matter of fact, she was well taken care of by them. She, I think, was very appreciative.
How did it translate to you? Because you're now the next generation. How did that spirit of philanthropy translate to you?
Well, I remember being very young, and every time I'd go out with somebody, my aunt would say to me, "That's not a philanthropic family," or "They don't give enough." And as you said in your introduction, I worked for the Jewish Federation in Montreal, and so these guys would take me out, and I'd go to the fundraising department, and I'd look up what their donations were to the Federation.
How old were you when you were doing this?
Oh, about 27, 28.
Okay, you're starting.
And I could hear my aunt in the background judging, well, do they give enough? Do they not give enough? It was the whole focus of the way in which I was brought up. On the other hand, my mother used to say, if you judge everybody by the way in which they give or the amount that they give, you'll have no friends. So I guess for her, that wasn't her bottom line at all.
But it seemed to stick in your psyche.
Absolutely.
And so when you grew up, what did you want to do? Did you want to be rich? Was that like a major focus for you? Or what did you want to do with your life?
I had a cousin who had a PhD, and I think I always wanted a PhD. I think I always saw education, thinking, pushing oneself in terms of thought process as my ultimate goal.
And is that what you did?
Yes.
So what was your education? What did you study?
I was so lucky. I went to the Heller School at Brandeis. I had an extraordinary experience. Can I go back a little bit?
You can go back, yeah.
I made Aliyah to Israel. And
now, was that a Sussman initiative?
No, that was also from way back. What happened was I had a cohort of friends. All of us went to Bethel Temple, and we continued after our bar and bat mitzvahs, and we studied with Rabbi Kessler, Stanley Kessler, who is still the Rabbi Emeritus of Bethel, and a dear, dear friend. And one of the people in the cohort was going on a USY trip to Israel, and I desperately wanted to go.
So you desperately wanted to go to Israel, but it came not from any outside influence. It came really from you and your friends.
I think it came from outside influence. The Sussman family was always involved with Israel. I knew that they had sent armaments in metal. They were in scrap metal, and I knew they had sent armaments during the War of Independence. And they always loved Israel. They were always talked about Israel. They were always generous to Israel.
Were they big in your life as you were growing up?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
One aunt in particular was like a second mother, and she was the one that had just an enormous influence on me.
So you're growing up. You want this education. You go to Brandeis, to the Heller School. And in that, you mentioned also that you moved to Montreal and you were judging your dates by the amount of money you were giving.
Right.
Was that sort of the beginning of the fundraising business? Did that sort of...
I started in Paris, not Montreal, and not Israel. I wanted to spend my junior year abroad. Well, we even went back further. We went to the USY trip. Okay. So I wanted to go to Israel with this USY trip, and I couldn't afford it. Rabbi Kessler got me a scholarship, and then I was talking to this particular special aunt, and she called all the Sussman brothers and sisters, and they all chipped in to make sure I could go. So right from the very beginning, I was accustomed to being helped in terms of my Judaic and my Israel-oriented lifestyle. So after that 16-year-old trip, I wanted to make Aliyah. My mother absolutely said no. She felt I would be abandoned, and she would be abandoned as she was when she entered the orphanage. So I ended up going to Paris. And because of the Sussman connections, I ended up as a volunteer with the American Joint Distribution Committee. And I worked in the soup kitchens in Paris in 1968, which was right after the '67 war. and there was a huge exodus from North Africa. I go back to college, I finish my senior year, and I know I want to work for the Joint. That was the soup kitchen hospice in Paris. I apply to the Joint, they send me to Morocco. So I spend several months in Morocco, and from there I make Aliyah to Israel. So that's really the story. So what happens is, my mother, of course, doesn't want me staying in Israel. I come home for Pesach. All of my things are still in Israel. I was supposed to go or enter the Paul Bayerwold School of Social Work, which had a special program for Olim, for new immigrants. I come home, and my mother had every catalog for every school of social work in the United States in my room. And as I waded through them, just to humor her, I saw there was a program at Brandeis, and I was going up to visit friends in Boston. I said, okay, I'll stop at Brandeis. To make a very long story short, I met Bernie Reisman and Leonard Fine.
Leonard Fine was the editor of Moment.
He was the editor of Moment. He was the guru at this point in time. And I was accepted on the spot. So it's a very long story. I entered Brandeis. I was in the Jewish Communal Service program at the Heller School. And that's a very important distinction because the Heller School was a PhD program. And notwithstanding I was an unaccredited master's student, I always had my eye on that PhD program. That was before.
But this business of fundraising, I mean, what is fundraising exactly? I mean, on a very, very superficial level, it's really selling. It's really selling.
Fundraising is two things. It's sales.
Right.
But from my Heller School background, which was a social change background, I looked at fundraising as an opportunity to affect change. If you can take money from very wealthy people, because I always worked with individuals. I didn't work with corporations. I didn't work with foundations. If you can accumulate money from wealthy individuals and look at a problem in society, or in our case in the Jewish community, and if you can attack that problem, then you are really taking, it's Peter Pan, you're taking money from the wealthy and
Robin Hood,
money from the wealthy, but not necessarily giving it to the poor, but affecting change in our Jewish society.
So that was your narrative. That's how you were able to.
And that's also how I was able to translate it successfully in the people to whom I solicited.
So you've worked in the community, not just the Jewish community. You've worked for United Way, you've worked for Goodspeed, you've worked for all different types of organizations. What we hear is that Jews are more generous than other people. Is that true?
From my experience, people who are generous are generous. People who are philanthropic, and it doesn't matter from whence they came.
Is there a difference between Jewish giving and non-Jewish giving? Is there some characteristics that Jews have that non-Jews do not, or vice versa?
No. No.
Do more Jews give than non-Jews percentage-wise?
You know, somebody once asked me a question like that. It was a lawyer whom I worked with in estate planning in New Haven, Connecticut, when I worked for the Jewish Federation in New Haven. And I said to him, and I remember the reply, and that was, I only deal with the best. I only deal with the most philanthropic. So I can't answer that question, because the people with whom I have dealt over the years, Jews or non-Jews, have been generous people, have been kind-hearted people, have some kind of history usually of giving, or they've been inspired by someone whom they've met. So to me, I only deal with the best, or I've only dealt with the best.
The other thing I hear in the community is that Jews have a tendency not to give to Jewish organizations exclusively, that they really spread their wealth around to non-Jewish organizations. Is that true?
Sure. I mean, Jews have the sense of tikkun olam, and tikkun olam is generic. It's we want to help the world. I think the Jews whom I've met probably give, I can't even say that. They're Jews who will give primarily to the Jewish community and still support organizations in the non-Jewish community because they benefit from them. They benefit from breast cancer research. They benefit from the hospitals in the community. They benefit from all of the arts organizations. So they are citizens of a community and they benefit from the non-for-profits.
But what is the big motivation for a person to want to give?
There's so many people who give that don't have the resources, who make sure that they give notwithstanding. I've had policemen come to me, I've had teachers come to me who've made really substantial gifts. And I must tell you, especially with my background, I've been amazed at rabbis, all kinds of professionals who don't have substantive resources in the way in which we think about philanthropy. So what makes those people give?
What's the big primary motivation of
I think
giving?
a lot of them is their background, their love of Jewish community. Something has inspired them. And by the way, I've primarily dealt with endowment development. And when people set up endowment funds, they tell you a story. They're honoring a parent. They're honoring something that happened during their lives. They're remembering a parent that went through the Holocaust. So there's something that's inspirational
to them,
and that's what's causing them to make this substantive gift.
You recently wrote 2 books. One of your books is controversial, that you say that too much concern placed on annual giving.
Correct.
Talk about that.
We as fundraisers, and even the boards, look at success based on the amount of money raised in any individual year.
That seems pretty natural because you have to have an operating budget.
You have to have an operating budget. The issue is that if we concentrated more on retaining donors, and this is why I call it the donor life cycle, from first gift through many, many, many years of giving, hopefully to ultimately the endowment gift, you're going to have more donors giving more money over the long run.
But who can wait over the long run?
If we are doing it correctly, we're also obtaining substantial money right from the very beginning because we're not losing donors all the time.
So you're saying that instead of analyzing what the gift was, to analyze how many years the person has been giving.
Correct.
And that is the most important parameter.
Correct. When I was interviewed for jobs, the question that people always asked me was, how are you going to bring in new donors? And after listening to that question in so many different instances, no one ever said to me, how are you going to retain donors?
Well, how are you going to retain donors?
You're going to retain donors by paying attention to them, by saying thank you, by not sending template letters, by not writing template emails, by not writing template thank you notes.
But how practical is that? I'm playing a bit of the devil's advocate.
That's perfect.
A small one.
Everybody does.
A small
okay.
one. A small
it's
one.
okay.
So you have the guy who gives $100
Right.
or less a year, and he's been giving it for 20 years.
Right.
How can you not send him a template letter when you have 2,000 people to worry about? How is it really feasible or practical to have a meeting with him?
So feasible, so practical, and let me tell you how. Because
That's
you're
why I'm
asking me
here.
the question how. And this is in all my books, by the way. How is as follows. You have a person who's given you $100 for 20 years. How about having a group of template people who've given for 20 years? And so the letter says, thank you so much for your giving over so many years. That recognizes that you recognize that that donor has been an ongoing contributor.
So basically what you're doing is segmenting the market.
Exactly.
There is a template letter, but the template letter is specifically for that group.
Exactly. Let me go on. How about if you say, let's honor those people who've given us 20 years or more. Let's bring them together for a luncheon. Let's ask them if they would like to consider something in their estate plan. Let's list their names in our annual reports. We now list in annual reports donors from large gift to small gift. How about cumulative giving? How about people who've given over time? How about recognizing them?
Well, how successful are you at selling this concept? Because I would assume that the people who are giving large amounts, and they're the ones who are sitting on your boards.
Correct.
It's not the person who's giving $100 over 20 years. How successful are you in selling this concept? It strikes me as a bit labor intensive, and it strikes me as very forward thinking and very long-term thinking, but I need money now.
You know what? Let's put it this way. How successful I am? Semi. I've seen a lot of change. I've seen the segmentation, as you say, by a number of years of giving. Thank you for your first gift. Thank you for your second gift. Thank you for your ongoing participation. That I've seen, I call it making change at the edges. I've seen people begin to say, okay, who are our lapsed donors? Because those are the people that we're not paying attention to. That's why they're lapsed. There's a reason they're not giving. Okay, we can't call all of our lapsed donors, but if we're going to segment them, let's at least begin to call the ones who've given us a lot of money in the past and then stopped.
We know 80% of the money comes from 20% of the people.
Right.
So you want to shift the pyramid. You want to turn it upside down. You want more attention to be focused on the 20% that aren't giving as much, but are doing it over a long period of time.
My last book, because of experience in the field, says, okay, the pyramid isn't going to shift. You're right. People aren't going to buy my model of long-term versus short-term. So what I have said, okay, keep the long-term as your framework. Ask the question every time somebody makes a gift, a first gift, a second gift, a third gift. Ask the question, what tools do we have to move that individual to the fourth gift, the fifth gift, the sixth gift, wherever we are? At the same time, when someone says to me, well, we don't have the resource to do all of that personalization that you're asking for, then I say, okay, impose the donor pyramid as your sorting tool. So for those who are lapsed donors, or those who have given you a large gift but as a first gift, you can do something different with them than the people at the lower end of the pyramid. But at the lower end of the pyramid, still be personal. Still say thank you for your first gift. Thank you for your second gift.
Are you saying that nobody says thank you to people who give like under $100? Is that what, because that's what I'm hearing.
They say it in a template fashion.
And that's not good enough as far as you're concerned.
As far as I'm concerned, it's not.
Are you also implying that among those template people, there's a needle in a haystack? There's one person who will emerge from that and give an endowment of, you know, a few $100,000?
And maybe $1 million.
Have you had that experience?
100%. And what I say in both books is that I wish I could go back and do it over again.
What would you like to do over again?
I would like to begin to look at our donor lists from the bottom up as opposed to our top down. I would like to look at donor lists by length of time of giving as opposed to, who made the big gift last year and how do we get them to increase it this year? In other words, I think we focus not only on the top of the pyramid, but how do we get the people at the top to give more and more and more? As opposed to saying, how do we spend some of our resources on looking at the people at the bottom of the pyramid and getting to know them? How do we get them?
How do you like the idea of volunteers doing this work? Because I see more and more volunteers doing this work, which I consider very sensitive work. Everybody knows why they're there. What do you think about that volunteer part of it?
I think volunteers are trained well. They have to be trained. I'll never forget when somebody called me up on Super Sunday for a gift, and I gave them, I guess, a gift that was larger than the average gift, and the person never said thank you. She says, boy, are you lucky that you can afford to give that amount. I was so taken aback.
Bad training.
Bad training.
So in conclusion, what do you see happening now? Like, do you see a shift? Do you see a shift in the way fundraising is conducted?
There is such competition for dollars today that if there isn't a change, those who are staying behind, those who are just looking at the annual gift, those who are just looking at major donors are going to lose out. And I think that based on the number of invitations I receive to speak and to train and to consult, that there is interest. And I don't take or accept an invitation unless people understand what my model is and they're willing to entertain it.
Are you popular with this model?
Pardon me?
Is this model popular?
There's an awful lot of people paying attention. There are more that are not, obviously, but I've been all over the United States and Israel teaching this model and have received numerous inquiries. There's another issue in all of this, and that people don't have the money for consultants, A, and B, they use them, what I call a chad-shtayim, 1, 2, 3, and then they never see them again. So in the second book, I say very, very clearly, unless you're going to bring somebody in and retain them in some kind of ongoing way to keep you on course, then don't bother, because these visits of one and going out and one and going out, because people are going to revert back to their old ways. So that's another issue in this whole concept, in this whole model.
So we've been talking to Debra Kaplan Polivy, and she's got some ideas. I mean, the idea that was most poignant to me, that the distinction between Jewish giving and non-Jewish giving, not such a difference. Thank you very much, Debra.
Thank you.
خطم خودی نشه بد که دوباره خطم خودی نشه بد که دوباره